The History of Poland Podcast, Episode 30, Losing the Plot. Hello and welcome back. As we talked about last time, Bolesław II is now known as Bolesław II the Exile, due to his, exile. If you were hoping this week would be the beginning of a restoration of a coherent period of time in Piast, Poland, I have some bad news for you. Now we're going to continue down the Avenue Chaos, where we examine a series of Piast rulers who all fight with each other, who can't really seem to get much of anything done, yet somehow still manage to stay in some one semi-unified state. It's confusing. Let's get into it. As I see it, this episode is when the Piasts really lose the plot here. So Bolesław II has been kicked out of Poland, and there are a series of attempts to restore his power, as we discussed last time. Eventually, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa came and defeated Władysław's successor, Bolesław the Curly, but instead of putting Władysław back on the throne, he let Mr. Curly continue to rule. Now, we quickly wrapped up the end of Władysław's life in the last episode, but we do need to rewind a bit. You see, Władysław was exiled in 1146, but Barbarossa's invasion happened in 1158, and Władysław died in 1159. That means that there are about a dozen years of Bolesław the Curly ruling over Poland that we need to talk about. That's what we're going to start talking about today. We'll see if it's one episode or a few. So, switching to Bolesław the Curly's reign, we have a source that's of great utility. It's by a guy named Jan Długosz. Now, those familiar with Polish history of this time period know that Jan Długosz was a Polish priest and is widely considered the first Polish historian. He was alive in the 1400s, so a couple hundred years after these events, but he did go out of his way to write a year-by-year account of this history for us. Unfortunately, this document has never been fully translated into English, but there is a version of it in English, which is great. I wouldn't normally explain the history of this translation, but it's unique and an interesting story. So the story is, this translation is done by a guy named Michael Morris. So I'm going to read a little bit of a review of his translation, which includes some additional background on Długosz by a guy named Paul Knoll, one of the leading modern-day Polish historians. Knoll says of Długosz and Morris, quote, "The great Polish historian in the Middle Ages, and arguably one of the great European historians from this period, Jan Długosz, was the author of a great epic chronicle of the history of Poland, and indeed of the whole of medieval East Central Europe. He was born into the lesser nobility of the region of Little Poland in 1415, and eventually studied at the University of Krakow, though without taking a degree. By the early 1430s, he had entered the chancery of Bishop Zbigniew Oleniski of Krakow, the de facto leader of the Polish Church and political advisor to the Jagiellonian family which now ruled Poland, and for the next half-century was at the center of ecclesiastical and political power in the Kingdom of Poland. Even after the death of his patron in 1455, Długosz continued as a canon of the Krakow Cathedral and a royal diplomat, an ecclesiastical and educational patron of considerable influence, and above all, as an historian. He wrote biographies, a pictorial description of the administration of Prussia under the Teutonic Knights and their military organization, especially at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, in which his father had fought, a heraldic study of the Polish nobility, historical catalogues of the bishops of Poland, a rich and extensive historical inventory of the estates and resources of the Diocese of Krakow, and most important, his Annales in 12 books. Late in life, he was appointed Archbishop of Lwów, but died in 1480 before taking up this position. Długosz's views were characterized by a clerical mentality, were conditioned by his noble background, the oligarchy of Little Poland, of whom Oleniski was the leader, and touched by the nascent humanism of Renaissance Italy. But the most important influence upon him was his public outlook on the importance of the Polish natio and its role in a region transformed by the gigantic dynastic structure established by the Jagiellonian family, a union of Poland and Lithuania, the kingship of Hungary, the growing influence in Bohemia, and rule over a number of peoples, Orthodox or until recently, pagan, who had previously lain outside the Latin Christian tradition. His narrative, from Poland's mythic beginnings to the year of his own death, became an epic of the Polish nation and its place in Europe. It is rightly regarded as one of the crowning achievements of medieval Polish culture, and understandably has played an important role in subsequent Polish nationalism. This translation has been done by a retired British civil servant, Morris Michael, who worked with and for the Poles during the years of the Second World War. He admired them, and when he became familiar with Długosz's history, regarded it as a literary gem and a work, as he puts it in his preface, on a par with the chronicles of Froissart and de Coligny, which should be made available in English. He decided to do a translation himself, but because his school Latin bore the rust of 50 years, chose to use as a basis the Polish translation by Julia Mrukowna, which accompanies the new critical Latin edition of Długosz's history being slowly published in Poland. Moreover, the full text of the history is nearly 3 million words, and Michael decided to limit his version to about 1/3 of that. Thus, what this volume represents is an abridged translation of a translation. That being said, it should be noted that Michael's text is fluid, lively, and true to his original. Some parts have obviously been left out. The whole first book of Długosz's text, dealing with Poland's mythic origins, is excluded, as are materials dealing with events west of the Oder and east of the Dnieper. Repetitious and panegyric sections, and full descriptions of such events as royal hunts and progresses. But there is enough here for the non-specialist to get a flavor of events and the details of morals, customs, ritual, habits, details of climate, husbandry, war, prejudices, and superstitions, and little insights which the translator found interesting." End quote. Długosz is going to be a recurring source for us over the next 200 years, so I thought it worthwhile that you know about the translation I'm using and some background on who Długosz is. As an aside, this book is obviously not in great demand, so the only prints of it cost $500. The version I have is on loan from the Carleton College Library, but I'll undoubtedly need to buy a copy in the future, so thank you Patreon supporters for helping cover the cost of this book in the future. Anyway, picking up the thread of our story, Bolesław the Curly has taken the senior position in Poland in 1146. Długosz tells us that, quote, "Peace and quiet now reign throughout Poland. Bolesław the Curly, with the agreement of his brothers and of the nobility, is given the principality due to the senior prince and the authority of the monarch, while retaining his own share of the realm, Mazovia and Kujavia. The new prince is both modest and liberal in his dealings with his brothers, relinquishing to them much that is his. As a result, they all trust him, accept his authority, and obey his orders without murmuring. He assumes the guardianship of the youngest duke, Casimir, who has left nothing by his father, and sees to his education." End quote. Almost immediately after assuming control of Poland, the Piast brothers, excluding Władysław naturally, joined something known as the Wendish Crusade. This crusade occurred during the year 1147, was primarily an imperial matter, but did have a portion of its soldiering force commanded by Mieszko III. While I'm not going to dwell on this crusade in particular, I am now going to touch on crusades in general. As we've talked about in the past, the crusades were pretty popular in Europe. While most histories of the crusades focus on the Middle East, there were crusades in other areas of Europe. The Wendish Crusade is one. Another, which is more of a Polish affair, though both the Wendish and the Second Crusade in the Middle East had a ruling Piast brother involved in them, is the Prussian Crusade. Now, when most people discuss the Prussian Crusade, they're talking about the crusade that lasted from the early to late 13th century. That also involved Poland, and I'm sure we're going to be touching on it again in future episodes, but there was an early proto-crusade led by Bolesław the Curly that started in 1147. Much of this is discussed in Dariusz von Gutner-Spyszynski's book, Poland, Holy War, and the Piast Monarchy. Spyszynski starts by telling us, quote, "In the late of autumn 1147, shortly after the conclusion of the Wendish Crusade, Bolesław IV led his army into the marshes and forests of Prussia. Bolesław's military campaign was successful, but only after Prussia's pagan inhabitants were given the ultimatum, baptism or death. This Prussian expedition, dubbed by Smolka the truly Polish Crusade, is rarely mentioned in the Crusade historiography, yet was considered by contemporaries to be part of the wider crusading effort of the Second Crusade, a holy war which hypothetically received the endorsement of the papacy." End quote. In one key way, this crusade against the Prussians was much like the earlier attempts to subjugate/convert the Pomeranians. People don't want to convert at the tip of a sword point. At the same time, while the Poles and northern Germans were invested by the Pope to crusade against the pagan Slavs with all due vigor, the reason they actually fought seems to be more an interest in financial and material gain, and less with the goal of actually converting the Prussians. The crusade against the Prussians was a mixed bag to begin with. Bolesław invaded, he managed to defeat some opponents, and with the threat of death hanging over them, he told them that they had to convert. Convert they did, Bolesław left, and the Prussians went right back to their old ways. Now, from the sources I have available, it appears that the initial foray into Prussia was only a brief stint without many lasting repercussions. However, in 1164, after a period of 17 years, Bolesław decided to re-enter Prussia. Lest you think that I'm skipping a 17-year period of history, worry not. Much of the major events related to the end of Władysław's attempts to regain power in Poland were what I discussed last week. Bolesław, though, is done with Władysław. He's reached an equitable agreement with Władysław's sons, and is in a stable situation with his neighbors. He married his family in with the Kievan Rus, the emperor is okay with his rule, and everyone is getting their pent-up energies exhausted by invading neighboring non-Christian lands. Bolesław continues that trend in 1164. Here's what Jan Długosz has to say. Quote, "With the emperor in Germany no longer a threat, and none of Poland's neighbors showing signs of hostile intent, Bolesław, with the consent of the Polish dukes, announces an expedition against the Prussians, a nation hitherto pagan, in order to convert them to the Christian faith and subject them to his authority. Having assembled an army, he crosses the river Osa, which divides the two countries, and advances inland with his army arrayed in 3 lines, the first under the command of Henry the Duke of Sandomierz, the second commanded by Mieszko the Duke of Wielkopolska, and the third by Bolesław himself." End quote. So we have the three Piast brothers come together in a joint invasion of Prussia. Bolesław we know, Mieszko we've heard about with his participation in the Wendish Crusade, and Henry we've touched on. We haven't talked much about Henry, but he did do a few notable things up to this point in time. One of which is that he journeyed to the Holy Land shortly after the Second Crusade and was under the command of King Baldwin III of Jerusalem. He distinguished himself well and was well respected both for his dedication to the church as well as for his martial abilities. Those traits would come in handy during this Prussian endeavor. Długosz continues on, telling us that, quote, "The Prussians, seeing that they are unable to resist, retreat into their forests and marshes and other impenetrable places, from which, wherever the terrain permits it, they sally out at night and harass the Poles, without ever engaging them in open battle. By the time the Poles have devastated half the country, the Prussians come to Bolesław asking for peace and promising to do whatever he orders. Bolesław tells them that, first, they must renounce the nastiness and errors of their pagan ways and confess the pure Catholic faith, without which they can expect no peace. If they do this, he will guarantee them peace and just conditions. The Prussians find such conditions too severe and arduous, so they go away and report back to their elders. The noise the crowd makes when the people hear what is required of them shows that they find such conditions unacceptable, but the elders, having quelled the murmuring, advise the people to accept, for otherwise they will never be rid of the Poles. Whereas, if they accept, once the Poles have withdrawn, they can fail to carry the conditions out. So the envoys of this cunning and crafty people go back to Bolesław and tell him that they will renounce their superstitions and pagan errors, demolish their shrines, throw down their idols, pronounce their adherence to the Catholic faith, and be cleansed with the water of baptism. Bolesław and the dukes then settle with the Prussian elders the extent of their obligations, and meanwhile, churches are built and clergy, especially those who speak or understand Prussian, are brought in to teach these neophytes. The Prussian district is entrusted to the Bishop of Chełmno. Finally, at Bolesław's suggestion, they issue an edict to the effect that all who now, or in the future, publicly confess the new faith are to be free men, while those who refuse baptism will be sold at public auction. This frightens even the most obdurate, who prefer baptism to slavery. Bolesław then imposes a small tribute on them, small because of their acceptance of the Catholic faith, the spread of which Bolesław is anxious to aid, and marches his army back to Poland, unaware that he has had the wool pulled over his eyes. So the Prussians have converted, I guess? But not really. But that's what we're going to focus on in our next episode. The ongoing battles with the Prussians continue unabated. With that, I will say goodbye for now. If you like the show, you can support it by going to patreon.com/historyofpolandpodcast. There are exclusive mini-episodes, history rants at your command, and an upcoming daily history podcast you can support the creation of. I also put a video up recently introducing the page, which was fun to make thanks to having a sister who can edit video. I'm a sound guy myself. If you don't have the change to spare, you can support the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, sending me notes of encouragement via email to historyofpolandpodcast@gmail.com, or by sharing the podcast with your friends. Until next time.